This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 490, Drupal Contrib First. On today's show, we're talking about Drupal Contribution, how you can approach it within your company, and why a Contrib First approach is important with our guest, Steve Wirt. We'll also cover config importer and tools as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Steve. He started building Drupal website for Syracuse University and then state tourism websites. And for about the past dozen years, he's been building Drupal applications for major agencies in the federal government, including the FCC, DOJ, Department of Education, Veterans Affairs, and most recently, the Senators for Medicare and Medicaid. A builder of things from Drupal modules to wood metalwork with an affinity for old tools, old ways, and giving back. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. Glad to be here.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Today, my co-hosts are Avi Schwab, technical product consultant at ImageX.
Hey, nice to see you.
I have to say before I introduce our other host, I use a service called ImageX. I don't know if you've heard of them. And every time I say ImageX, I almost say ImageX.
Is it like an image processing thing or
Yeah,
something? I feel like I've
yeah,
seen that. Yeah.
yeah. It's pretty good.
Yeah. ImageX has been around a long time. I think there were fewer namespace conflicts when they chose the name originally.
And also joining us as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
I always thought it was a Imagex, so clearly pronunciation matters.
We'll have to do a blog post about that.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Avi Schwab, a technical product consultant at ImageX and a maintainer of a number of Drupal. I feel like this should say something like a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and camp organizing aficionado.
Well, since I started working on OpenY, if you'll note, I am the maintainer of many modules. Um, they're not technically my own, but I thought I'd leave it in there because, I do have a lot of modules assigned to me now. Anyway, so this week, have you ever wanted to streamline the management of config changes during your Drupal project deployment? Importing individual configuration changes from Contrib or custom modules and syncing settings across different environments. There's a module for that. That module is config importer and tools, also known as Confi, CONFI. So the config importer and tools module was created in April 2016 by Andrei Podnenko, also known as Podorok on Drupal.org. There's a 3.2.0 version that works with Drupal 9 and 10. And there are some D11 fixes in the queue that are waiting to be reviewed. So that should be out shortly. The module is actively maintained, although it's a developer module that's been mostly stable for a few years. So there haven't been too many major releases lately. It is covered by security coverage, and there are some unit tests. There's a video documenting the process on the module page, and there are also instructions on the module page for how some basic documentation on how to use it. There are 8 open issues on the module, 3 of which are bugs against the current branch. There are about 300 sites using the module right now. The module has 7 maintainers across a number of different agencies in Ukraine. So this module, as I said, it's there's no user interface. It's all of its work is done through its config import services. There are 2 services that it uses, an importer and also the param updater service. The importer service imports full configuration files, and the param updater service pulls in single parameters from a config file. Both of these services can be used in install files of Contrib modules or in your own site to pull in configuration during database updates. This can be helpful for adding a new feature, modifying existing features, or pushing changes to many sites, perhaps through a distribution. There's also a spiritual successor to the Confi module called called Upgrade Tool, which has similar functionality with some extra features as well. And that is at drupal.org/project/upgrade_tool. So now let's talk about the config updater, config
So
importer. Sorry.
I have questions. I have so many questions. First one is, how does this differ from something like, well, how does this enhance, I guess is a better way to put this, the like core config management system? And how does something like this differ from what you can do with something like config split?
Sure. That is a great question. As I was going through the issues, there is a question in the issue queue that is, I think, exactly that. Um, the main use case for this module is for pulling in config from lowercase f features, if you will, uh, not capital F features, but most of how what we do here when we're building modules for OpenY or other distributions, you can use these services to say, I'm updating a block in this module, or I'm
Hmm.
updating some piece of config in this contrib module. Um, I want that config to be specifically pulled into the site when I do database updates. So
So
it's not something that you would do if you were just running a single site, but it's more for managing lots of different
So,
contrib.
so it's basically a way to import partial configs based on the changes needed determined by the development team, as where like config sync is obviously like import export whole sets of config, and config split is more of like, hey, this config is going to be specific to this site, and put, split it out. Is that like a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's
Mm.
that's correct. So config sync is really like, you know, I update a view, export the config, and then I push that config to my project. Config importer is useful if in the workflow that I'm generally using with it. I have a dev site that's totally separate from all of the other sites, but it's like the base kind of install of a distribution. Um, I change a view there. I export that config and dump it into a module that sort of acts like a capital F feature. Um, then I write a little hook in the install file that brings in that new config and imports it with config import, and then push that up to the contrib module. Now, any site that's using that contrib module, when they pull down the new version, they'll get that new configuration. It'll be updated when they run their database updates, and then they'll be able to config export that new configuration and push it up to their environments for that specific site.
okay,
So
I see now. So yeah, I actually have two questions myself that are related to that. Then so we could have used this. So I have a client that has CSP headers across about, I don't know, 7 or 10 sites, and they all have to remain in sync, right? It's not really a distribution, and we used to struggle with that pretty significantly. Anytime a new service came out that was added to GTM, for example, we would have to like update 10 configs. And so we solved that recently by using recipes actually, and using the config update action. But it sounds like this could have been an alternate solution where we could just have one site where we create the new CSP header configuration, export that to a module, and then use that module as a way to update it, export it, and push it up, right? What,
that's correct. I think the config update stuff, I'm not totally up to date on the I've not been updated. I've not updated my internal records on config update and, and recipes. Uh, but yeah, I mean, this has been around for obviously a long time. So this was a really good way of doing that distribution like stuff without like storing all of your modules in a single distribution profile.
okay. And my second question is, and it sounds like you may not have updated your internal register for this either, but does this handle like dependency pulling it? So like, can this help assist, for example, creating recipes? So an example is I built a recipe for a client recently where I just created a recipe to create a ton of paragraphs that they had used in one project and they knew they'd want to reuse them in another. And I forgot about form displays and manage displays. Does config importer provide a UI for like building out the dependencies that you want to pull in? Or is it literally
Bullet one, this module has no UI.
good to know?
Yeah,
We're still
no,
missing that feature.
John's correct. You would have to either use something like features to kind of dump out all the related config there, um, or just usually the process that I do is I make a bunch of changes in a kind of dev site that I have, and I'll just config and export from there. And I've got that dev site in like just a Git repo that's not actually connected anywhere. So, I can see the changes that I've made, and then when you make those paragraphs, you can kind of see what changes have been exported recently and all the dependencies there. But yeah, this module doesn't provide any of that. You've got to figure out what the right workflow is to figure out all those dependencies.
So, one last question from me. What is a spiritual successor?
It's a thing that does a similar thing that is not exactly the like direct upgrade path, but at some point down the line, somebody decided we should do it a slightly different way and created like a new thing that does a lot of the same things, but is a different thing.
Got it. Okay, cool. So basically,
It's like a V2 with a new name.
you just got a twofer, folks. You got a module of the week twofer. Okay, sounds
There
good.
you go.
All right. Thank you, Avi. So if folks wanted to suggest a module of the week.
Yeah, if folks want
Yeah.
to suggest a module of the week, they can reach out to Martin Anderson Klutz on Drupal Slack at ManClue. I am his temporary replacement for the week.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. After 5 years, Drupal Camp England is back. Here's James Hall to tell you more.
It's time for Drupal Camp England, a one-day Drupal camp on Saturday the 1st of March at the University of Cambridge, the first major Drupal event in the country for 5 years. Drupal specialists, agencies, service providers and end users will gather for a packed program of speakers, sessions, discussions, networking opportunities and an evening social. Highlights include speakers from the Drupal Association and Drupal CMS, covering the Drupal CMS roadmap, AI, UX, and recipes. There'll be sessions for all skill levels across 2 tracks, covering technical and non-technical, alongside experts who'll be on hand to answer any questions. For enquiries, email admin@drupalcampengland.org and find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, and the Drupal UK Slack channel. Tickets are just £25, on sale now through Eventbrite. For more details and to purchase tickets, visit drupalcampengland.org. That's drupalcampengland.org. See you on the 1st of March.
Thanks, James. Okay, now on to our primary topic. Let's start with kind of a top-level question, Steve. Can you tell our listeners what do you mean by Drupal Contrib First?
Sure. So Drupal Contrib First is the contrib part that I think a lot of us are familiar with, that we're preaching to the choir here about, right? We build something, we give it back. Contrib First just shifts it so that we give it back first. We give it back as part of the development process, not that we craft this thing locally and then later sometime we get around to like giving it back. This is actually, we build it in Contrib first. We build it from the ground up. We start with a namespace for a module, and we start with issues in the issue queue that are about building that module, not about bugs, but mainly just a smattering of feature requests. And we start building that module in the Contrib space first.
Interesting.
Largely the impetus for that is, when I go to Drupal camps, and like Florida Drupal camp coming up, I like to talk to people about their, how did you get into Drupal story? Because everybody's got a different, interesting how they got into Drupal story. And then out of that, if you built a module, and and you talk to a lot of people that are like, yeah, I built one, but I haven't given it back yet, or I got one that I really want to contribute, but
Mm.
I haven't done it yet, and it sits on a shelf, largely because so in my line of work, working with government agencies, they're actually happy to give stuff back,
Mm.
but they aren't happy to do it after the fact, because once you've built something for them and you've solved their need, they don't have like this let's go back and give it back later kind of thing, because that takes more cycles and more time, and it's something you're not moving the needle on in the forward direction. And so there's always this like idea of a gift that never happens, right? Everybody's got an idea for something they want to give back. They may have built it, they may have built it well, but for whatever reason in their mind, it's not contributable yet. And that last little bit often takes forever, or it never happens. And I think the best way to avoid that is just to avoid it altogether and build it as Contrib first.
So I'm assuming that when you're kicking off a new project or a new site, right? That you're not like there are some things, some aspects of it you may not you may not consider Contrib first, right? Like, so like if you have a module that's going to be kind of proprietary to the client or to the site, like you're not dropping that in a D.O repo and like putting that code up on the internet. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair. I think I tend to lean a little bit more toward thinking like, how can I architect this so that I could give it back? So
Yeah.
I like if I can extend it 10% so that might be useful to 3 other projects in the world, right? And there's a lot of projects in the world. If I can extend it 10%, I'm going to try to lean in that direction. But I'm probably not the norm in that regard. But yes, there would be still, a smattering of custom modules or sort of your junk drawer modules that do everything, all the other business logic in the site that's not normal, um, are still going to exist. I'm not really a proponent of contributing those back. There will be some, absolutely custom business logic that a client might need.
Yeah.
Um, but if I can spot something in it that has a redeemable feature, I may try to exploit that.
So interesting. You just kind of led me onto my next question here, which is you just said like, hey, if I can produce a module, right, that's going to help like 3 other sites, then I'm going to try to put that up on Drupal.org. But I'm wondering like, how does this approach help the Drupal community, right? Does it sometimes create noise? Like if you're building a module and one other site is using it, is that module then just kind of like noise in the community and like require your time and effort to keep it up to date and to keep it, maintained? Or like, is there real value here because you're seeing through taking this approach that, it is very helpful to the community. Like people are kind of like taking these modules and running with them, and like you're seeing kind of growth in a lot of these use cases.
I think there's a risk for noise. And certainly a good example is
Mm.
we namespaced a module, and we were committed to building that module for something that the government client needed.
Yeah.
And then a week before we were ready to actually start building it, there was like a change of plans at the government level, at our client level, that said, we don't need this anymore. We thought we needed it, we don't. And yeah, the module sits out there. There's absolutely no code in it. There's, the structure, a little bit of the README that's there that tells what it was supposed to be. But there's not even a repo that was created for it. So yeah, there might be a little bit of noise, but for that one, that kind of didn't really crash and burn. It wasn't a bad idea. It was just the client elected to go another way. And none of us that were involved had the time or the desire to carry that to build it for something that wasn't needed, right? We aren't all able to just build things just for the fun of it, right?
Right.
Time and money and all that. Um, but for that one, there's 11 other modules that I built as Contrib First that do have some value, and that have gone out and progressed past the alpha stage, and have been usable by a handful of others or hundreds of other. It depends on the given module.
Mhm.
But I guess where it hit me, uh, several years ago, I was working on a Drupal project for the DOJ where they needed to do a bunch of menu manipulations. They wanted to standardize a bunch of menus across a bunch of multi-sites. And menus being content, that gets a little complicated. And so I did a bunch of work there that was not contributed to manipulate menus on the fly so that if somebody rearranged something, it would pop it back into place. And then I left the DOJ project and moved on to a different government project. And I had to basically smash the hard drive that I had on the DOJ project with a hammer to render it dead, and I no longer had access to that code. 3 years later, I'm working for the VA on a project at the VA, and they needed the same kind of thing because they had a bunch of menus, hundreds of menus that they needed to standardize. And I had to build that all over again. And it brought back memories of my childhood. We used to heat our house with wood, and I spent, hours upon hours of my childhood moving firewood from pile to pile. And I didn't like that ever. And so this felt like the same thing. I'm building the exact same thing I built before. I have to do it all from memory because I don't have access to that code. Thankfully, the VA's repo is a little bit more progressive. Their repo is public. So if I had built it custom, I would still have access to it. I'm like, no, I'm going to build this as Contrib so that I never have to build the same thing again. And so now we have Contrib menu tools, which lets you do a bunch of things with manipulating menus and stuff
I feel
like that.
I feel like that could be like a T-shirt, like "Stop Firewood Development," and just wear it to conferences and have people be like, "What's firewood development?"
Yeah.
So does that thinking kind of go into your thought process when you decide like, hey, Drupal Contrib first? Is it like, is this going to be useful for other people? If yes, then yes, let's do it. If no, then no, I guess we don't need to really do it. Or is it like just a firm belief that like we are just always going to do it, whether it's useful or not?
Well, I think for me, where I look at it is, I've got a bunch of experience across multiple government projects. I can listen to something and go, yeah, we could use that over here, or
Right.
I'm sure this other they all have different requirements, but they also have kind of a core set of requirements that are certain that things are useful. And I just kind of spot it that way. It's like I can use this over here. I can use this, when we bid on this next government project, they're going to need this. And so I think I have a good sense for those kind of things. The example of the one that we're building right now is alt text validation, something that when you go to save an image, it says, not only is your alt text not empty, but is there something of value there? Are you just putting in the file name, right? It's going to validate that. And we're actually building that as Contrib First right now. If you go to the alt text validation module, it's not ready for prime time. It does not actually do too much yet. It does a few things for reporting and that kind of thing. But when we're finished with it in a month or two-ish, it should do all those things. And there's not a government agency site that I can't imagine using this on.
Right.
Yeah,
I
that
think
sounds useful.
I think it's really I think it's really, really important to kind of stop. I found stopping ourselves from asking the question, can everybody use this? Because we're not hundreds of thousands of other people. We may not know, what other people's use cases are. And I think I'm really excited about kind of trying to formalize these ideas because, I mean, views module, I would imagine wasn't a thing that, that Earl sat down and was like, I'm going to write this module that everybody in Drupal is going to use, or date module, or, unless you're on the Drupal acceleration team and your job is to write contrib modules that do everything. I think this is kind of how how Drupal has grown, right? Somebody writes a thing and maybe it gets used by a couple dozen modules and maybe it gets used by a couple 100,000. But as long as we're architecting things in an abstract way, then we can kind of set those projects up for success either way.
Yeah.
But going further on that, Steve, why do you think this is a good idea for companies to adopt a Contrib First approach? What's in it for the people doing the work?
for the people doing the work.
Or for the companies or the whether it's an agency or a client or whoever,
Gotcha.
you know,
But
what
yeah, I
we
think
touched on.
probably the best way to address it is from the client point of view, right? When we contribute a module, not only do we make it so that the company itself could, if you're working for an agency, other projects on your agency might be able to use it. So there's that to it. I think it's like if you were to look back at, as though you're looking at a website and its architecture with kind of a magnifying glass, where are you likely to see the dilapidated code? Are you going to see that in the custom modules? Or are you going to see that in the contrib modules? And so I think, a lot of what this offers is if you can shift some of those modules to contrib, right, they're just going to age better. They get, automatic, a lot of like bot automation that's gone in on Drupal.org to, Drupal Rector, all those kind of things that that do updates for a module. That if that module is sitting in your local, those aren't going to happen. You're going to have to apply those on your own kind of thing. So I think there's, some of it is just the idea that the module's not going to rust. The way a custom module sitting in a custom directory is going to not age as well. So I think there's definitely that. I think, absolutely there's the contrib credit sort of thing, right? If you imagine that every ticket that went into developing, a module with a fair amount of features, creates an issue. If you're creating granular issues on Drupal.org, there's a lot of issues that get attributed to the company that helped build it and the agency that you're building it for. So, when I'm building something, it's not just attributed to me, it's attributed to Civic Actions. It's also attributed to Centers for Medicaid, Medicare, or services, or whatever agency I happen to be working for at the time. And that gives them the benefit of seeing this thing. So that I think is a lot of it, is that you're just building, it's also the kind of idea of like, when is your house the cleanest? Oh, right before you open it up for people to come over, right? Like, it's that same kind of thing. You're putting a module out there for the public. You tend to up your game just a little bit, like just to increase your own brand, to make yourself look better.
So
This also might be the third episode in a row that I use this phrase, but I feel like it highlights well. Rising tide lifts all boats. If everybody open sources and follows Contrib first, I mean, the reason why Drupal 6, 5, 6, and 7 were so easy to get into was there was a module for that. There was something that you could use. And so if you even if we don't, even if every single project isn't putting out like this full featured, super extensible module like ECA, for example, even just putting out utility modules that do one thing well or integrate between two things gives you the gives the community the flexibility to be like, you know what? This module does 90% of what I need. I'm going to use it and I'll contribute something back. Or even if they don't contribute it back, they're kind of inherently testers of that module, which is also useful. So if every kind of company takes this approach, we'd get back to quicker, because I think we've been moving that direction. But we get back to there's a module for that. There's a way to get what you want done in the UI.
So I think I agree. I agree with what you're saying, Nick. And I think, Steve, like, you hit on a really interesting point there of like, hey, you get a whole bunch of automated testing, you get a bunch of other eyes on it to like test it and make sure, it works the way that it should. You don't have to you don't have to worry about your code deprecation and stuff like that, because it's not your custom module sitting on in your own repo. It's out there and people are kind of like working together to keep it current. But I wonder, like, how do you sell this idea to a company or a client when they go, well, okay, once it's out there, who's going to maintain it? Because there's a certain amount of maintainership or ownership once you put a module out there, for not only for yourself to use but for other people to use. How do you kind of combat that criticism?
But yeah, on a bunch of different levels. I think in terms of selling it to the client, In the government space, it's actually kind of easy because U.S. Digital Services has done a great job of like advertising and promoting the power of open source. And Drupal is the best example of the open source community that there is. I might be biased, but I'm pretty sure it's the best example there is. Um, the the other aspect of like the maintainership, right? I created the content model and site documentation module while I was at the VA. And I'm also using it at Medicare because it's a great way to like to see the architecture of your site, see the diagrams of things, that kind of thing. So VA is still using it. Medicare, Medicaid is now using it, and any contributions that I do to improve that, to fix any bugs, whatever, add new features, are now getting credited to Medicaid, Medicare, and so again, we can all maintain this. It doesn't have to be, well, I created this thing, now I'm stuck maintaining it just out of the goodness of my heart, kind of thing. I can, if it's something that's usable across my the agencies that we work for, that's a huge effort.
So the
A
maintainership
huge benefit,
kind
I
of
should say.
the maintainership kind of happens organically, basically. If you reuse a module within your organization, a couple of different times, then a couple of different developers, people within your organization have kind of the ownership, if you will, of
That's
maintaining
right.
and updating that.
And Civic Actions has been great about saying, if there's a module that we're not using with the project anymore, either because, the project disappeared or came back, like in the government space, they're always kind of like trading partners and it's like watching the dance floor. We might not have an active use case for it, but we've also committed to, we're going to still maintain these anyway. If there's a bug, if there's an issue, we're going to try and take care of it. And we're allowed to, accredit some of our time that's not billable hours to doing that. And so I think, Civic Actions as a company makes that commitment. We've documented this Contrib First. It'll probably be in the show notes. And our documentation is open source too. So anybody that wants to take this and spread it to their own organization, their own company, I highly encourage it. In terms of like selling it though, because I guess John, that was your question of like, how do you sell it? Oftentimes I find the hardest people to sell it to are not the person you're building it for. It's other developers that haven't done it before. And I'm not talking about other developers that haven't built a module before, right? They know what goes into it, but almost always I get a little bit of pushback from other developers of, this is going to add more time or this is going to take longer. And I say, how do you know? Well, because I built a module, but have you ever built it first before? And that's why I rely on a little bit of my swagger about it. Like I built it just under a dozen of these this way, and I know it doesn't take longer. It seems like it should for a variety of reasons, but it actually usually doesn't take longer for a variety of different reasons. Right?
Yeah, I think.
Just pulling it in via Composer is easier, right?
Well,
right?
well, there is something to be said for that. Like, it does add a little bit to the workflow when you're trying to edit it, right? Because now you have to have, the composer one that you pull in plus the edit one, but that's not a significant hurdle. I think the other hurdle for developers, and they may, and I've had the same issue, but they may be saying it takes more effort because they're thinking like, I need to go over it with a fine tooth comb to make sure it's perfect before I release it, right? Because now you're putting your name on something public, and it can be hard to release something, um, not know, like, because you don't know what you don't know. So if you do something wrong, you can be worried that somebody will find it. So for example, I maintain a number of modules. I found it much easier, for example, to release Migrate Boost, which is now getting some popularity, even though it doesn't work with the current version of hooks, and I have to finish updating it. Um, I found it much easier to put that out because I basically, and I gave credit and posted who did it, because I copied it from a GitHub repo and just put it on Drupal.org, generally for my own use and to get it in the Drupal ecosystem again. It was easier to release that and release my first module, which all it does is make paragraph forms available on the front end so that somebody visiting the site can add content. Like I needed a way for people to create content without giving them, full blown add content permissions. And, that module is like, I don't know, it's tiny. I think it just has like a single like form alter or something, like something small. But like it was much harder to put that up because it's like, well, what if people look at this and then judge my coding skill based on me doing something I don't really know what I'm doing here versus me maintaining a module that I technically didn't write and now I'm maintaining. And that can be a pretty significant hurdle
Yeah.
as well.
I mean, I think it's also important to have this conversation to kind of lower the barrier to entry. We talk about that all the time. I feel like too is like your code doesn't have to be perfect to put it on Drupal.org.
Right.
Like it's not going to be, and you are there is not a perfect coder. Like as we've seen with AI, computers make mistakes just as much, if not more, as people do. And so, I think and we're all putting stuff of our own out in the public anyway. Like if you post on any social media, right, you're putting your own stuff that you create out in the public all the time. We shouldn't just post code like we post Facebook posts or whatever, but like I think it's still important to kind of make the point that um, it's okay that you create something for your clients and you do the work to abstract it and make it like work for other people. But it's never going to be, exactly the right solution
Yeah.
for everybody else. And it's okay to do that. Yeah. I mean, the other thing I think, I've found in working on modules this way, um, a lot of the time I will find modules that don't work for my use case, and maybe they work 25%, but that code is still on Drupal.org, and so I'm not going to pull that module in. But I can pull a piece of that module, or I can pull some of the code from that module that uses something different. Say you use a smart date like service that I didn't know existed because it's new and it hasn't been documented yet. I think there's huge benefit too in building the library of code that we have as just good examples of how to do things, in addition to being useful kind of building blocks.
Oh, and that's
Yeah.
a great point because we've been talking about Contrib First being about contributing a module, but one of the portions of it is that if there's a module that does, like you said, 70% of what you needed to do, but they're still missing, 20, 30%, whatever, it's missing something. I've had good luck with contributing that back. We were using a site alerts module to put messages up on a screen, and we needed to be able to control those by commands run in Jenkins to like tell it when the site was going to update. And it didn't support drush commands, so we added a feature request to the module, put in a patch to have it do drush commands, so you could post messages that way. And that contributing it first, then we used the patch that we contributed until such time that patch crossed the finish line and got merged into the module. But I would definitely still call that contrib first, right? Don't make the patch that you keep locally and keep it a secret, right? Contrib it first, get it out there. And so it's like all of that.
Well, now, yeah. And with GitLab, like I've done this in our company too. Like with GitLab, it's so much easier to just spin up a patch from a repo on Drupal.org and then pull it down than it is to do it locally. That process is so powerful now that GitLab is there, and you can make a patch online just by copy and pasting some code.
Yeah. And I'll say another benefit of this kind of long term for yourself is you can't take over maintainership or get opt into security coverage without going through kind of an audit process, which you can't do if you don't have code that you've written on Drupal.org. Part of the process is them. Oh, well, I guess if you technically released a module on GitHub and use that, you could, but you have to have like an example set of your code in order to apply for that, and that process can take some time. So if you're writing Contrib First, you write a couple modules, it can be a way to kind of start that process early. Because for me, it took I think 2 weeks to get that review, maybe 3 weeks to get security coverage, to be able to opt into security coverage. So having more modules and more stuff to pull from is useful if you decide to do that too, which I would encourage because one of the other benefits of having code up there is you have other people looking at your code, and if they know a different way of doing things or a better way of doing things, they can reach out to you, and you get the project update bot. I mean, there's a lot of bonuses. to
Oh yeah,
doing it.
and the bigger bonus that the tests just run on Drupal. Like I think that's a huge one. If I have a local module and I've got the same test coverage, those tests run every time I make a pull request to the entire repo for the project.
Yep.
And those add up over time and can take a significant amount of time. If it's a contributed module, the tests run every time there's a pull request to that module, but they don't run in my local stack of tests or on my, on the project's PRs for the agency. So it saves a ton of time and cycles and running a bunch of tests that don't really need to be run every time. So I definitely see a savings there. And where I push back in terms of people saying, oh, it takes longer, where I see it usually taking longer is in two places, and it's not usually the obvious places. The first place is making something a UI for it instead of just hard coding a bunch of junk. Like that takes a little bit longer. But in the long run, I think that's a savings for the agency that's then going to need the flexibility of that UI in a couple of years and not constantly needing a code change to change something. The other place I see it taking a little longer is in creating really atomic issues, very small issues on Drupal.org. And I've seen that play out great, especially just recently with our alt text validation. There were so many times where I'd have ideas. My mind works better at night, so I'd have a bunch of ideas at night, and I'd create a bunch of small tickets. And I would say 6 nights in a row, I would wake up the next morning and somebody already had a PR in for that was not affiliated with Civic Actions or my organization or anybody I knew at all. If the ticket was small and it looked like it could be done in a couple of hours, they were just getting taken off.
Nice.
Props to Needy27 who closed about 8 issues for me while I slept. It was fantastic. And so, a little bit more time creating smaller tickets that I might not create if I was just doing it with my own localized team that had worked with me and knew how to read my wills and desires on modules and that kind of thing. But being able to be a little bit more atomic about things, like if you've got to create a UI interface for the settings and then something that setting does when it's set, don't create it in the same ticket. Create the ticket for creating the UI and then create the ticket for what acts on that. And people will, can work on it so much easier because it's a small commitment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we talked a little bit about how you approach this with internal devs and how you approach this with clients, but civics, as you mentioned, Civic Actions kind of has this as an organizational wide mandate. How do you recommend having this discussion internally with non-developers? Like managers, CEOs, presidents of the company. Like, how do you try to get your organization
Legal departments.
legal departments?
department.
How do,
I don't know if I'm even qualified to touch the legal department side, but I think again for Civic Actions, it was a really easy, like it's part of kind of who we are as a company, and so that was an easy sell. But we have had to do some time, some work, and it's still ongoing with getting product managers on board and project managers and tech leads. I think from my sort of purview, tech leads are the ones that can create the space for this, to create the space for their engineers to have the freedom to do this and to spot something that they think ought to be good in Contrib and propose it, because they, more junior or even a newer engineer, not necessarily junior, but just newer to the company, might not go out on a limb to propose something so dramatic kind of thing as contributing a module back while you're building it. But I think tech leads can definitely create more space for that, create kind of a sense of calm around it, that we know this can be done, we've done it, let's do it again. Project managers, I think they need to be able to communicate the benefit to the agency. And again, in terms of Civic Actions with government agencies, lots of times that communication is fairly easy, especially when there's a memorandum that came out of the Obama administration that 20% of all of their code had to be contributed back. That helped us make lots of agencies meet that. Now we have the new Share IT Act, which is now a law, became a law in December, that all code for government has to be contributed in some way, either made open source or has to reside in well, there's a bunch of different stages that it can be
Don't
in.
tell them.
And so this approach, selling it to government agencies, tends to be very easy, unless you get a project manager at that agency or product owner at that agency that's new to the government space. And then you have to go back through all the ideas of, this makes the agency look good. This helps you fulfill requirements. This is better for the long term of this code. It will the community will maintain it a lot better than your dedicated team will maintain it long term if it's sitting in your local modules. The savings of just tests, I'm sure there's a way to compute that out to what it costs for a test that runs 600 times, a day for an agency versus once on Drupal.org when there's a pull request for that module. There's definitely a cost savings there.
I was gonna say I mentioned the legal the legal side of things too, because I've contracted and worked with a number of higher eds and nonprofits, where there's some, especially when I was an independent contractor, there's some clause in the contract that's no code shall be shared ever, do not share any code with anybody ever. And so, I worked with other contractors who well, I said that, that I can't share any code with anybody, so I'm just never going to publish any of the code that I wrote here. But maybe the IT person who that we're working for is yeah, sure, fine, it's all good. I'm all in with Drupal, but once it goes up the ladder, there's always some blocker there who's I don't know, I have questions, I don't really understand what GPL means. And so I've always been looking for ways to kind of formalize that, it's really okay. It's going to help people. You're not going to get sued. Which is always a really hard kind of challenge.
I mean, it feels like it's gotta be an organizational effort, right? It's not like one person just one day decides, hey, I'm going to start sharing my code on on the internet, right? It's got to be there's got to be some structure around it. It sounds like.
I think it is often one person just decides they're going to start sharing their code, not in a Drupal agency, but in the client, the client side of things. They may not have any idea about open source in general.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think it's more of an education, right? Educating them as to the benefits, and Steve's definitely hit on a bunch of really great benefits as to why you should do this, right? So I mean, I don't think the suggestion here is, if you're listening to this episode, that you should go rogue and start contributing your code to Drupal.org, because that could get you fired, right? But I mean, I think there's a lot of great points as to why it's a good idea to take this approach. But let's imagine that you're working, Steve, with a client that doesn't want you to take this approach. What would you do or say to them to either try to maybe not even convince them? Maybe they're just no, absolutely not. Is this a case where, you might say, you're not really a good fit for us, or, you could even remove yourself from the scenario and say, if you run into a client that has that mindset, maybe you just, maybe you just don't contribute the code. But what's your kind of default statement if somebody's resistant to the Contrib First approach?
Well, I think, that's a great question. I am a developer, so I don't get those conversations about whether they're the right client for us or not.
Sure.
And again, I haven't run into, so I can't speak from a lot from experience here of selling it to clients, because again, I haven't had a hard time doing it, because the government is, they've already opted into Drupal.
Right.
They've chosen civic actions because, largely this is part of our DNA. And so we haven't had a lot of those hard communications where it's been difficult to sell. I did have a project manager that was from another company that kind of started hyperventilating about this idea of giving it back because they had no comfort with it and thought it was going to bloat up the budget and take too long, and was really not willing or able to hear any of the arguments, like stopped listening as soon as the
Yeah.
and so we elected not to contribute it back. And that's why the text validation isn't being attributed to the VA; it's being attributed to the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, because they had a different project manager that wasn't opposed to that. And so, like if there's a requirement, like legally, and lots of times in our contracts there might be something about that, but I think we try to work into Civic Actions tries to work into their contracts that we will give stuff back when the opportunity arises. So those conversations happen long before we're actually in their code doing it.
And I mean, I think you build a really good case as to why it's a good idea, and agencies, right, should take that approach, and why clients really should want, obviously, their non-proprietary or non-confidential code out there on the web, right? Like, you've provided quite a few really great examples of why it's a good idea. So I can understand, I can understand people, I can understand people gravitating towards that. But there are always going to be one or two people out there that are
And it
opposed.
goes back to that rising tide lifting all boats that Nick
Right.
referenced, right? If 3 other agencies are contributing stuff back, and like, oh well, they're doing it, so maybe we should be doing it.
Yeah.
I
I
think
think
it's great bragging rights for an agency, right? Like
Right.
it came up. I was watching the Senate grilling the CTO at the VA about, why is your site not accessible, or why are there this portion, and they lump 2 accessibility things into, it's saying the whole thing is not accessible or something that, like it could have been very powerful for somebody at the VA to say, and we're, not only are we making accessibility important for us, but we're contributing back this module that makes it better for all other government agencies too, right? Like that could
Yeah.
have shut down the whole Senate investigation, possibly, probably not, but like that carries a lot of weight. There's a lot of bragging rights to saying not only are we doing this for ourselves, but we're doing it for everybody else. Like
Yeah.
it's
I,
hard
I
for
think
somebody to say
there's
you're not doing enough when you're doing stuff for somebody else.
I think there's another point too that you could bring up if you ever have a project manager struggling with this, is show them all the contributed modules you're using and be like, even if it takes us 20% longer to contribute this back, how much more of a budget would you need if we had to build the menu system from scratch, or we had to build views from scratch, or we had to build any number of or any of the patches? Like, hey, we're using these 5 patches. It took me 20 minutes to fix this bug because I Googled it, I found the Drupal issue, I read the issue, found a patch, applied it, and it fixed it, rather than having to use Xdebug to step through to understand how views works and figure out where the bug was and apply the patch myself, right? So, so maybe there's ways to combat those concerns as well outside of like the mandate. We just talk about like, look at how much we're building on top of the backs of giants here elsewhere. We're trying to be the giant in this case and provide some of that back. Yes, you might have to add 5% or 10% to this small piece of the budget to account for communication and, the release workflow, but we're saving literally thousands of hours not building Drupal from scratch, probably hundreds of thousands or millions of hours. Um, and so you're you're just giving that back so other people, get the same.
It takes me back to like my when I used to hire developers, right? I would always like ask them the 80/20 question, like, hey, if you have to build, like, a client comes in and you have to build them a feature, and there's a module on Drupal.org that does 80% of what you need, and you can just build the additional 20%. Are you gonna do that, or are you gonna just build it yourself? Like, the guys that said, like, "No, I'll take the module that does the 80% and build the 20%." Like, I'm like, "Yes." The guys that are like, "No, I'll just build it myself. It's easier. Like, I can build it custom." I'll be like,
You
no,
can go write WordPress.
no, no, sir. That is the wrong answer in my humble opinion. Sorry."
Yeah. Yeah. So Steve, we've talked about kind of how you can do a Contrib First development cycle with not a lot of overhead. And I think as kind of senior tech leads and architects and stuff, this a lot of this comes naturally to us. But I'm wondering how you kind of mentor and build confidence in more junior developers at Civic Actions and are in the community, and how you kind of build people up to thinking about developing in a Contrib First way.
Oh, great question. Yeah, that's actually what I'm doing a lot of now at the company. I hold office hours twice a week for anybody that wants to contribute something back. I am a parrot that squawks, "Can we contribute that?" Like at every meeting that I'm in, whenever whenever somebody's talking about, excuse me, a new feature that they want or something like that. Um, and so I'm kind of relentless there. I try to partner and bring other developers along so that I'm not the only maintainer on a module. I get somebody to co-maintain it with me so that they get involved with the process. Then I drag them around to present on it, and next thing you know, they're an expert on it, right? And so we present at GovCon, we present at Florida Drupal Camp, stuff like that. So trying to grow the team, and I think the biggest thing for me is to grow the team by example as well. Like, just, okay, let's do this, and I'll help you walk through. Like, here's how this goes. And so we've got a page written up about how do we approach Contrib First from a developer's point of view. That'll probably get in the show notes as well. That kind of breaks it down step by step. And I hold hands or shoulder surf wherever I can be of help there, just to get more people comfortable with it. It's like I say, the biggest pushback I've gotten is from developers who think that it takes longer because they haven't done it before. And so if I can push them over that threshold a little bit and make them see that it's really not that bad, and the water's fine, come on in. I think that's the best I can do.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's good to hear there are other people like that. I've been like trying to every time I see a like local patch on any of our projects, I'm like, why isn't this on Drupal.org? Why isn't this on Drupal.org? I know you had to download the patch file, but there should be an issue number there, right? Like, you just trying to kind of keep that mentality of like, you know, uh, unless there's like very big secrets in this patch file, which there should not be, and you're doing patches wrong anyway, then, you know, this is, it's okay to open an issue. Um, you know, even it's okay to write a patch on Drupal.org, even though there's no issue. Like, you have a Drupal.org account, you can make an issue.
Absolutely.
So yeah, there's so many ways to just kind of get people into that cycle.
Quick sidebar. When you say local patch, you mean local patch without a corresponding issue queue. You're not referencing the actual Drupal.org patch file in Compose.
Yeah.
Like, all patch files should be local,
Exactly.
but they should also exist on an issue.
I mean, a patch in Composer without an issue number in whatever your local convention for connecting issues to
Very good.
patches is, which I also
Doesn't
think we should
reference
have a
enough.
standard for how we reference issues in the comments of Composer patches, but that's a totally separate.
I mean, yeah. Since we're on that sidebar, what I do is I just put the link, but not the whole link, because you can do Drupal.org/i/ and then the number, and I found that that's short enough to and then you can click on it and get there.
Yeah, there's also the link shorteners. There's like dgo.to or
I forgot about that.
dgo. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are a couple of those, but yeah, I like putting some kind of link in the comment there.
The annals of terrible developer advice from an architect that you shouldn't take, from my personal site, I actually just use the GitLab like patch files.
Okay, you should absolutely never
not do that, because they could change and break your
thing. They will change.
Hey, listen, I will say, admittedly, I've had really good luck with that on my
I'm gonna find
my personal site.
Every patch that John has commented on and push updates. That you should not do that. Absolutely not. But anyway, back to the show. As somebody who might be interested in getting started with this process, how would you recommend people start thinking about problems? Because the we're I think everyone in the show is very pro Contrib first, but if we're being realistic, even if an organization is very pro Contrib first, not everything should be Contrib, right? There are there are a lot of like little utility things where like you're writing a preprocessor that's going to like modify their specific data structure to output in a certain way or cache in a certain way. There's no way to make that extensible. There's no utility in releasing that. How do you go about evaluating something and determining if it's something that would be useful to be contrib in the first place?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to pin down the exact process. It's one of those things as an engineer, we just sort of spot it like, hey, this could be useful elsewhere. And sometimes that changes over time. Like there are things when you're in the moment and you're building it, you're thinking that this wouldn't be useful. It's too specific. And then like 6 months later, you're like, maybe I could genericize that a little bit and contribute it back. Um, so I've tried to be kind of pragmatic about it, and like something that I thought about contributing now might not have been a thing that I would have thought was contrib worthy 5 years ago. I think I've just become more aggressive and more confident, I guess I should say, not really aggressive in my thinking on it, but more confident in my thinking on it that, yes, this could be used by 2 other sites in the world, if they're in this right situation. The other thing that I'm okay with and that I've become okay with is creating a module that just does partially of what its ideal ought to do. Right. So when I create the namespace for the module and I'm creating a bunch of feature requests, my client may only need A, B, C, and D, and not the rest of the alphabet on things. And I will build just A, B, C, and D. And if anybody else wants to pick up the other feature requests to build out the rest of it, that's okay too. I've built things very with a very narrow parameter on it. And part of my development process on it is, okay, anything that I'm going to call the MVP for what my client needs, I'm going to mark as major in the issue queue. And when all those majors are done, it's ready for them. And
Yeah.
doesn't have bugs, whatever, in that regard. But I let those other feature requests sit, and it may be something I come back to later when I've got excitement and energy, or it may be something that somebody else comes back to. But it helps provide a little bit of a roadmap of where I'd like the module to get to. And
That's
I'm
clever.
okay with it, with saying it might not be me that gets it there. I will at least be the person that gets it to MVP, to a first official release for whatever the requirements were that I needed. Um, and hopefully I've accounted for things in a way that the the things that are added later don't change the API so much that it breaks it for anybody that's, so it's always backward compatible.
So
Uh,
this approach goes hand in hand with perfect is the enemy of good enough. Like if you're taking this approach, like, get that MVP out. You can always iterate on it. You can always improve it down the road, but like get the MVP out. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect.
Or
Absolutely.
in Drupal terms, you not all contrib modules have to be web form.
Yes.
Sure. We'll give that one to you. Why not?
Well,
Okay.
I guess I've even. Oops, sorry. Go ahead.
No, after you.
I've worked in. There have been times where, say, the Veterans Affairs needed. Uh, we used to send information to um, Gov Delivery, which is kind of like Mailchimp for Gov. But we had a specific requirement for VA where they couldn't send the information that was like queued to be sent until the corresponding page had been posted on Drupal.org or on va.gov. But there was a timing there because va.gov only released its content every hourly at that point in time. So we actually made it so that the content release would ping the Drupal site to say, go send anything in the queue to Gov Delivery now because the new version of the site is up. There's nobody else that's going to need that requirement for that module, but Gov Delivery module still has that one little feature where you can ping an endpoint with a timestamp and it will send anything from before that timestamp. And we might be the only person that the only site that needed that from it. There's still a whole bunch of other stuff that it does, but that one little piece might have been specific to VA. And we built it that way.
gives people the option, right?
Right.
So we talked about Civic Actions website and the fact or documentation more specifically, and the fact that it's open source. We'll definitely have some links in the show notes for the topics that we kind of covered today. But I'm wondering, as we wrap things up here, are there any tools or tips that you can share from your experience with the Contrib First approach that you think might be helpful to folks?
Sure. One I've already touched on is just keep your issues and your feature requests as small as possible, as atomic as possible in the issue queue. That really helps other people contribute to it. Other things that I've done that I've found very useful is creating, like a fake epic in the issue queue. Not really fake, but like the issue queue on Drupal doesn't really have epics, so I put epic in the title of it. And I've done this both ways. One using the related issues to kind of be the issue queue for that epic, and one actually spelling them out as a bulleted list. And I've fallen back recently on using the related issues, because you can actually sort those, and they update immediately. Where if you put them in a bulleted list, they might show the red or green, but they kind of get locked in time. They get cached in a different way. And so even though issues have been closed, they don't show up as being closed in that. So I've been using the related issues lately for that. And that works pretty nicely to be able to move things up and down in that list. Again, to help convey to people, like, all right, if you're interested in working on this, what's the next thing in this epic list that needs to go? Again, I think that's been real effective at having a large percentage of our commits come from not us.
I think that's a great way to solve that, actually, because I've noticed the same thing. The bullet list will update if you like leave a new comment. But related is a little bit faster. I think one way that at least the core issue does this, and I'm not suggesting you change how you do this, but it's just an observation. I think the core issue queue uses the meta tag, like you add a bracket, meta bracket, as kind of, or plan, bracket, plan, bracket, or policy, no patch. It, Policy is more about like discussion about policy around things, but they use the meta kind of as that way of doing epic in core. And then you just use related or a bulleted list to kind of track everything else that needs to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah,
We
it's
just
a workaround.
with Camp.
Yeah, it's a workaround. There's no, because like you said, there's no real way to kind of specify that this is an epic that is tracking other issues. All right. Well, thank you, Steve, for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking about Contrib First and learning how you guys implemented that at Civic Actions.
Thanks. Appreciate your time on it.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on the socials with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. All right, before we close out, Steve, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, had any questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm Swirt, SWIRT, on Drupal Slack and Drupal.org. Best place to reach me.
Perfect. And Avi, how about you?
I'm Froboy, FROBOY, on Drupal Slack and Drupal.org. And you can get in touch with ImageX at imagex.co.
Great. And John, how about you?
You can find me at Picozzi.com or on the socials in Drupal.org at John Picozzi. You can also find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.